All right, hello everyone. We are looking at the economy. We're looking at late CHOSON Korea, economic growth, landed farmers, and wealthy merchants. So I hope at this point you have had some time to think about the questions. What is an economy? And what is the purpose of an economy? The economy, just to simplify it to its very, very basic form, is the wealth and resources of a country or region, especially in terms of the production and consumption of goods and services. So the economy acts to allocate the goods and the services. And what we're looking at, what does this mean during the Joseon Dynasty? What was the purpose of the Joseon economy? What kind of goods and services were being provided here? And the goods in general are largely rice. There's some cotton and some hemp. And the purpose of this is to allocate all of these resources so that everybody has enough to eat, basically. This is really, when we're talking about the Joseon economy, this is a very agrarian economy. In fact, during the Joseon Dynasty, this was probably the most agricultural period than any other time in Korean history. And during the Joseon Dynasty, anti-commerce policies were initiated. So, for example, there were harsh measures taken against Yangban for trading during their travels to China on embassies. And there were very sealed borders. And sometimes these punishments even included death. So, to give you an example of this, I'm going to read an excerpt from an article that was written about the borderland area between the Qing Dynasty and the Joseon Dynasty. This event took place on December 25th, 1749. And what had happened was there was a dispute between the Joseon people and some people from the Qing Dynasty. And there were some people who had crossed over the borders, the most northern border. They had tried to trade with each other, but those trade negotiations, they did not go well. And there was a dispute between the two parties. And this is the result of that dispute. So there was a man who had suddenly appeared, and what he told the authorities was that he and his traveling companions had been attacked. So the authorities went to the area where this occurred, and they found, they said, at the foot of a mountain located to the northwest of the Mukde River, they discovered 2 charred huts and 5 corpses scattered around the huts. All the corpses had wounds on their faces and heads consistent with having been struck with axes. While all 5 men had been scalped, scalping means when you're, the skin and the hair have been peeled back from your skull. While all 5 men had been scalped, with their bone marrow exposed, the skin on the faces of 4 of the men had also been ripped off, leaving behind only the bones. There are no traces of another person and the horse that had been described. The huts in which the corpses were discovered were located about 3 li from the hills marking the entrance to the Tumen River. So what ensued after this was Chosen authorities were sent to the area to investigate. Qing Dynasty authorities were sent to the area to investigate. Qing Dynasty authorities are discussing amongst themselves what to do about this. Chosen authorities are trying to discuss what to do about this. The local authorities in that area discussing amongst themselves and conducting joint investigations, and then they have to report back to their authorities. So Qing Dynasty obviously reports to the Qing, eventually the Qing Emperor. Joseon Dynasty authorities, they report back to the Joseon court and the Joseon Dynasty King Yeongjo. So for what are the problems or what are the issues that arise here? This is not simply an economic problem, but we have the problem of border crossing. So the inability of authorities to be able to contain their people, to keep them on their territory. We have Joseon people who are crossing over into Qing territory and vice versa. So there's this movement, this inability to control the movement. And from the perspective of the Joseon court, this becomes extremely problematic because they have to make sure that in their dealings with the Qing Dynasty, the Qing Dynasty is satisfied with how the Joseon court handles this matter, because 5 members of the Qing Dynasty have been murdered. This is a very serious and complicated issue. So the Joseon court has to make sure that they take the right measures for investigating. They want to do this swiftly. They don't want to drag it out because it makes the Joseon court look bad. And then they also have to make sure that the proper people are punished and that they are given the appropriate punishments. Because again, they want to satisfy the Qing Dynasty and the Qing Emperor, because they don't want to cause any kind of friction or conflict between the two countries. So this is exactly what occurs, and in the end, what the result of this incident is, said that so there were the people who were convicted of this crime. All of the criminals were executed, so they were all beheaded, and then their wives and their children were made slaves, and their family fortunes were forfeited. But it doesn't stop there. So not only were the perpetrators of these crimes, not only were they executed, and their wives and their children were also punished by being enslaved. The governor of Hamgyong province, which is where this incident occurred, and the commander-in-chief, they were both removed from their positions. And then the magistrate was also removed from his position and then exiled. And so this had far-reaching repercussions. It did not just affect the individuals who perpetrated these crimes, but it went all the way up to the governor of the province. And once this punishment was then decided upon, it was presented to the Qing Emperor, and the Qing Emperor because he was satisfied with this punishment. He said, in response, sent to the Choson king, he said, considering the immediate manner in which the criminals were arrested and reported to the court, the Choson king shall be exculpated from any guilt. So, because the Qing emperor was satisfied, because the Qing emperor was satisfied, he decided not to punish the Choson king in any way. And so, what I want to impress upon you with this example is that, what this tells us is that this kind of population movement, the control of population movement and the control of trade and the exchange of goods between peoples of different countries. This is extremely important from the view of the Choson state in order to ensure security and stability. The last thing that the Joseon dynasty wants is to upset the Qing and to have this extremely powerful neighbor to its immediate west, and to know that the Qing were this fierce, conquering people. They did not want to upset them in any way, and so it was very important that the Joseon state monitor the economy, and this also meant monitoring the population and making sure that the borders were sealed and that you didn't have people just crossing over willy-nilly. And so this is why I give this example to show that it was very important that we have this kind of restricted trade during the Joseon dynasty. There were private merchants, there were government licensed merchants, but there were very strict government regulations on trade. The private and the government licensed merchants, they control much of the flow of trade within Korea and with foreign traders from China and Japan. But regulations limited both private and public trading activities with outside countries, with China and Japan. And so we have close cooperation between the government and the merchants, and foreign trade increased from the 17th century. All right, so we do have a certain amount of trade with the Qing and the Japanese. When it comes to trade with the Qing, there was official trade when embassies were sent to from Choson to China, and there was the payment of tribute. There was also private trade through the border territories, like an open market in Uju, or in Hwaeryong and Gyeongwon, there were open markets. And so this incident that I just described to you, this happened near the market in Gyeongwon. And then once Koreans got to Beijing, to the Qing capital, there was the Korean embassy who set up shop at the residence there. And they bartered goods with Chinese merchants. There was also some amount of trade along the route to and from Beijing, and then along the Chinese-Korean border in authorized border towns. So there was a limited amount of trade, but again, the Joseon state wanted to regulate this as much as possible. And again, the official views of this, the reason for this was because of stability. As long as the Joseon state was able to manage trade with China, this contributed to the resolution of border disputes. It ensured domestic stability, and it allowed an opportunity for the aristocratic elite, for the Yangban, to procure luxury items for the court and for the Yangban. And so the government closely monitored this trade and discouraged other forms of trade. And this then lent itself to a policy of very strict border control. As I mentioned, looking at the map here, for the Choson dynasty, they have this huge and formidable entity that is its immediate neighbor. And so it's just not productive for the Choson dynasty to be in conflict with the Qing dynasty. Okay, what were some of the imports that were coming in from the Qing dynasty? Some things were included textiles like silk, high quality cottons. These were often coming in via the Western trade into the Qing dynasty and then into Joseon. Medicine, fur hats, stationery. But all of these things, they reflect the demands for luxury consumer goods of the ruling and the wealthy classes. These are not goods that are being consumed on a mass basis. So we have a very small population that is demanding these goods and consuming these goods. Now, if you remember from the last lecture that there were sumptuary regulations, and so if you were a Yangban, you could wear certain kinds of clothing and use certain kind of materials like silk, or you could use certain kind of utensils to eat with or transportation. And so because of these sumptuary regulations, if you were of a lower class, then you were not supposed to consume these things. And that's why we have a very small portion of the population that is demanding these luxury goods. There were some wealthy merchants and some middle people, 중인, who had grown wealthy through this embassy-related trade, and who also consumed Chinese luxury goods. But it was a limited degree of trade with China, since only a minority consumed these. And some of the exports going to the Qing dynasty included precious metals, so gold and silver, some animal skins and leather. Ginseng was the big one. In fact, one of the items that was to be traded in this incident that I explained to you at the beginning of the lecture, this involved ginseng trade. And there were other things like paper, cotton, leather. So these were some of the things that were being exported into China. And we are discussing the economy of the late Joseon dynasty. So if we look at the coastline, so we've talked about the northern border and the relations between the Qing dynasty and the Joseon dynasty. If we look at the coastline, so this is really the other border for Korea. This was an issue from the end of the Goryeo dynasty and into the beginning of the Joseon dynasty. And it was, there was a problem with widespread piracy. Now, the coastlines, they were subject to raids by these pirates. The pirates, they had a base on Tsushima Island or Temado. And at the end of the Goryeo dynasty, they had tried to clear out these pirates by burning ships and But by the beginning of the Choson dynasty, they had to strengthen their naval forces again in order to deal with this ongoing problem. So there's an attempt to negotiate with Japan. Joseon had asked the Ashikaga shogunate to suppress the activity of the pirates, and exchange they would offer some legitimate trading privileges to the So clan that was based on Tsushima Island, and given rights over ships sailing from Japan to Korea. But the head of the So clan, he died in 1418, and his infant son takes power. And we all know that what happens when you have very young boys that take over power. And so the power was seized from him by a powerful pirate leader. And so then pirate activities then increased, and they began invading Ming China and wreaking all kinds of havoc in Joseon. As they would invade China on the way, they would invade Korea, and so there were these repeated requests from both the Ming Dynasty and the Joseon Dynasty to suppress these pirate activities. But it really just gets out of control, because at this point, Japan is not centralized. We just have a whole array of these feudal warlords, these daimyo, and they are fighting amongst each other, and so it's difficult for the shogunate to maintain his own power and defend himself against these powerful daimyo, much less go in and suppress these pirates. So after a while, it just gets out of hand, and so the Joseon dynasty decides to put an end to this. So after receiving reports of incidents of these pirates as they are going back and forth to Tsushima and the Ming Dynasty, and on the way wreaking havoc in Korea, the Korean court, they get all of these reports. And so Sejong, who is the king at this time, he decides to take a very offensive approach. And his father, who had abdicated the throne but was still a military advisor of Sejong, he leads the charge against Tsushima, or Temado. So on June 9th, 1419, Sejong declares a war against Tsushima, citing that it belongs to Joseon. So this is our island, and they conduct an expedition, and 227 ships are sent over with about 17,000 soldiers. And so this means that they really mean business, right? They're not just sending out a small group for information gathering. No, they went in there to really put an end to this problem once and for all. And so Lee Jong-mu, he goes in and he captures Japanese pirates and asks for their surrender, but he doesn't really receive a reply from the head. And so he sends out expeditionary forces, and the soldiers go in and they proceed to just kill and plunder and destroy. When he went into Tsushima, he found about 131 Chinese captives of the pirates and 21 slaves on the island. He also found 129 ships. So 109 of those pirate ships were burned down and destroyed, and the remaining 20 were captured. And there were several skirmishes with the insurgents, but overall, in the end, about 600 prisoners were captured by the Joseon forces. And then a treaty was negotiated between the two. And so the So clan surrendered on September 29th, 1419. And the Joseon government agreed to grant the So clan limited trading privileges and access to Korean ports under the condition that the So clan get control and stop any coastal pirate raids. So this treaty was signed. It said that the Japanese then they offered tribute to the Koreans, and the Joseon dynasty then released the Japanese prisoners of war, and finally the last treaty was signed in 1443, and this granted the So clan monopolistic trading rights to trade in Korea. All right, so if we look at the trade with Japan that then followed, there was both public and private trade, and this was done through the Japan House in Dongnae, and it's like the trading spot here in near Busan, and the Japanese, they exported things to Korea. They exported things like silver, copper, sulfur, pepper, liquor, ceramics, textiles, and the Korean exports that were going to Japan included, of course, ginseng and rice. These were kind of at the top of the list. Cotton, leathers, tiger skins, other grains. And so we see developing this trade system between China and the borderlands, and between China and Korea, and Korea and Japan. So you have all of these different goods that are moving between these countries. And there are also the Jurchens. So the Jurchens, they are to the north here of Korea, and again, this is not the most pleasant weather in this territory. So sometimes the Jurchens will cross into Korea for food or clothing or other necessities. And this then creates a need for markets in these northernmost areas. So like in Gyeongsang and Gyeongwon, to pacify these people, because if we don't trade with them, if Joseon doesn't trade with them, then they're going to come in and they're going to forcefully take these things. So at least give them a limited access and limited opportunity to trade with the Joseon dynasty. And they traded horses and furs for cloth, farm tools, and grain. And later on, these became entry points for the Jurchen tribute missions to the Joseon capital. Now, there were some commercial developments from about the 17th century on. We see the appearance of commercial crops. Commercial crops are crops that are produced for trade, so not just for consumption, but to trade and for profit. So we do see the appearance of these kinds of commercial crops. Some, like, I guess the most saleable commercial crop is tobacco. So tobacco is grown and then sold for profit. And we have the production of, or the appearance of, these kind of like free hand craftsmen that start producing things. And so we see private merchants and city shopkeepers who then try to interfere with these private merchants by banning them. But as commerce develops and these goods become more widely circulated, it's kind of impossible for the shopkeepers to keep the merchants out. Under the reign of King Cheongjo, there was a policy of free commercial activities, which then eliminated the restrictions against private dealers. And so then we see the commercial activities of merchants really beginning to develop. We also see the appearance of domestic markets in Korea. In the countryside, the markets became very active, and then we see regular markets appearing in each local region. And in the large cities, there were permanent markets that were opened. In the markets of the local regions, merchants and peddlers, they made their transactions. And in the middle of the 18th century, there were about 1,000 markets throughout the country. And following the development of these markets, the roads were improved and currency was circulated in order to facilitate this trade. And then we also see the emergence of these like middlemen and facilities that would also then facilitate the trade and the movement of these goods. So there is some amount of growth in the market economy in the 17th and 18th century, some amount of monetization. And it just shows that there's an increasing strength of the private merchants in the 18th to 19th centuries and a decrease in the government's ability to regulate them. But when we look at the Joseon dynasty economy, it's really the agriculture. That was really the mainstay of the Joseon dynasty economy. There were some changes that occurred after the 17th century. Between the 15th and 17th century, it was really pretty stable. But then afterwards, we see, for example, the introduction of new agricultural technology, the development of irrigation facilities, land reclamation, so land that had been destroyed during the Japanese invasions and the Manchu invasions. They tried to reclaim this land and make it arable again. There were handbooks that were written and distributed to farmers in rural communities. And we also see the construction of dams and reservoirs to help with the distribution of water for these crops. So as a result of the expansion of these irrigation facilities, rice paddy fields increased. And the rice transplanting method, which had been used by some farmers in the early stages, was popularized. And what this essentially did was it helped to reduce labor power and increased production. So transplanting is a practice for growing rice in the lowlands. And you take young rice seedlings from a nursery and then you transplant them into a cultivated field. And it requires less irrigation, less weeding, fewer seeds, and provides higher yields. So because of this, the Korean farmers are able to produce more rice. They started cultivating barley in rice paddies after the harvest. So then you also have, there's a certain set time period that you can harvest rice. And instead of just leaving that land until the next year when you're going to plant for another crop of rice, during that time they would plant barley. And they also started developing dry field farming. So this allowed a way to have a larger harvest. So just increased efficiency. Started using fertilizer, and a new strain of rice was introduced that ripens quicker, and that actually allows, instead of one crop of rice a year, you now have 2 crops of rice a year. So you've just doubled your crops. And then there were new crops from the Americas that were introduced into Korea, including the potato, the sweet potato, and tobacco. Some other developments by reducing labor power through these new methods of farming, you have the per capita of arable farmland increasing. But it's really the large landowners who benefited from this rather than the farmers. The landowning farmers, they did increase their crops, but some of the owners who had these very large pieces of land and employed farm laborers to help them cultivate this land, these were the ones who really benefited from these agricultural developments. So in the 18th century, these commercial products were cultivated in order to increase the income of farm families. So we see now a wider development of commercial products, including ginseng, tobacco, cotton, fruit, and herbs. But what happens is by the 18th to the 19th century, although a few people experienced some increase in wealth, the majority experienced hardship. So the Yangban, they generally avoided commerce or were not allowed to engage in commerce. But the middle people, the Chungin and the Hyangni, the local clerks, they were able to accumulate quite a bit of wealth through trade. Most peasants, though, found their situation increasingly more difficult, as a result of increased royal or landlord-owned farmlands. So as the royal family or these Yangban families, they increased their land holdings, farmers who lost their land were forced to become either hired farm laborers or day workers. And those farmers who did still own their land, they were increasingly taxed more and more. As I mentioned in the last lecture for last week, the Yangban, they did not have to serve in the military. They did not have to provide what was called like a tribute tax, and it's the commoners that had to do this. So there was a tribute tax that was paid to the government, and this meant that they had to produce a certain amount of bolts of cloth as a tax, and this became increasingly burdensome for the families, and then also the corvée labor. So if there was some kind of public project, then they would be taken off their land and then mobilized for these public projects. And so you see this happening, and then as corruption amongst the officials increases from the 18th into the 19th centuries, and they are overtaxing the farmers and the commoners. This all contributed to the overall hardship that the commoners faced.